Hi, my name's Eleanor Caputo, and thank you for joining me in today's photography workshop. Today's lesson is about aperture and depth of field. Okay, well, before I delve into what aperture is and what effects it has on your depth of field and your shutter speed and your camera in general, I just wanted to explain a little bit about F numbers and maybe clear something up. I get asked this question a lot, and I know that it confused me, and it was hard for me to wrap my head around F numbers because I couldn't understand why f1.8 was a big opening, not a small opening. So F numbers, which are the numbers indicating your f-stops, can be confusing. It's hard to wrap your mind around the small number actually corresponding to a large opening and not a small one. For instance, F32, which is the smallest slice on this pie chart and the darkest one, because of course a small aperture lets in less light. While f1.8, which is the lightest and largest section of this pie, is the largest aperture. So if you think of F numbers as fractions, and if you replace the F with a 1, it becomes a fraction, and you can see it a little bit more clearly. We all know that smaller fraction numbers indicate larger portions of a pie. Well, the same goes for an f-stop. So f1.8 is twice the aperture openness as f4, and f8 is twice as small as f4, and so on. I've indicated on this chart in gray, in tones of gray, to indicate how much light will come in at that setting. So you can see it gets considerably darker as you stop down. Stop down is to bring your aperture to a smaller opening and a larger number, letting less light in, stopping the light from coming in, hence the name stop down. Opening it up means to open up your aperture and let more light in. Okay, so I'm going to go on and continue on to what happens to your camera when you change these settings. Okay, hopefully you have a little bit better understanding of the F numbers now, and I'm going to go into what the f-stops are and what aperture is, what it does to your lens, and the effects it has on the image you're trying to create. Certain things happen with an f-stop or a camera when you change your f-stop. It can affect your shutter speed directly, and sometimes can cause you to have to adjust your ISO as well. But for the most part, an f-stop affects your depth of field. The F in f-stops means focal, like your focal range, the range in which what will be in focus and what will be soft or blurred in an image. So your focal range is the range inside the image that you're viewing through your camera that you're taking a picture of. And if you have your subject in front of you, you're focused on that. The depth of field is the amount of blurriness before and after your subject. You don't really notice the blurriness before a subject because you don't usually include the foreground when you're doing portraiture. So usually you notice the blurriness behind the subject. So let's start with f1.8. f1.8 is the largest aperture opening you can have in your lens. That opens your lens wide open and lets the most light through. So f1.8 has a wide open aperture, which the cause of that wide open aperture And the effect it has, the cause is the wide open aperture. The effect that wide open aperture has on an image is it creates a shallow depth of field. Almost nothing is in focus, and of course it lets the most light in, and because there's plenty of light, it doesn't need a very slow shutter. It needs the fastest shutter there is. A split second, boom, your shutter's opened and closed, exposing your sensor to the light. F2.8, you're starting to close down a little bit. It's still a very large aperture, still very shallow depth of field, very little's in focus. And when you're focusing on a subject and you're using a shallow depth of field, especially f1.8 and f2.8, if you're not precisely focused on the subject's eyes, if, for instance, you're doing portraiture, if you're not focused on the eyes exactly, they could become very soft and you could accidentally be focused on the tip of the nose. And it is extremely noticeable when that happens. So you have to be very, very precise in your focusing. I would use a manual focus when it comes to smaller and more shallow depths of field. So, and you can see in the diagram with the squares, the subject matter in the foreground is always clear. What's behind it is blurred. And as you see, as we go through F4 and F5.6, the blurriness starts getting more sharp and more clear, and your depth of field becomes deeper. Your subject starts getting lost in the busyness of the background. So if you're looking to isolate something from its background, and the background is very busy and not just a plain color, then a shallow depth of field and a low aperture is the best setting to isolate that subject from the busy background. But as you stop to F5.8, F11, F16, and F22, and even F32, everything starts becoming extremely clear and sharp. So F16, F11 through F32 are really great landscape settings. However, as you stop down, less light comes in because the opening, the aperture in your lens is much smaller, therefore letting much less light in. The effect that this has is on the shutter. It causes the shutter to stay open longer to expose that sensor to the light it needs to create an image. Here is a good example of isolating a subject from the busy background. This is a piece of wheat, and there was a lot of other greenery around it. Now this was taken with a 100mm macro, and I believe that the depth of field, or the f-stop, and the aperture were set on f2.8. This is a perfect example as the effect it has at f2.8 on an image. I was clearly focused on the ladybug. He's just the very tip of that piece of wheat, and the ladybug are in focus. So that's a good example of a shallow depth of field on f2.8. And here's an example of a landscape taken at f22 on a fairly bright day. I did use a tripod for this, but you can see that everything, I did not isolate those weeds from the background. I wanted everything to be clear to show the depth of this image and the depth of the scene, all the way back to the small mountains in the background. So I chose not to isolate those plants and flowers from the background. However, you could do that. You could choose to use a shallower depth of field and a lower f-stop to isolate them. However, because it's such a vast view, the depth of field, the blurriness would not show up as much as it would if you were in a more intimate setting where you were taking a picture of something smaller and more intimate. This is a very vast view, so the blurriness and the shallow depth of field will somewhat get lost in the depth of this scene, and you'll hardly be able to tell that those mountains are softer. And that has to do with the closer you are to a subject and the length of the lens that you're using, which I'm going to get into more in just a little while. I'm going to show you now a little exercise that I did using pins to show you further the effect that the depth of field has and the aperture settings have on your depth of field. Okay, so here we go. I've made a few diagrams, or I took a few pictures using pins spaced about 2 inches apart to give you a better idea of what the aperture does to an image when you're shooting it and when you've got it on a particular setting. So in the first one, we're going to start off with f2.8. And as you can see, I've got 6 pins lined up, and I'm focused on the red one in the center. And as you can see, this aperture setting, which is open fairly wide, lets in more light, and it creates a shallow depth of field. So you can see that anything in front and anything behind that red pin is very soft or blurry. As we go to F4, you can see that the pins just before and just after the red pin are starting to come in just a little bit more clear. And as you can see, I'm stopping down and the aperture opening is slightly smaller. So, and now we're at F8, and as you can see, the opening, the aperture opening is quite small, and the pin before and after the red one are becoming quite clear, and even the yellow one and the blue one are starting to become clear as well. And as we move to F16, things are becoming quite sharp and quite clear. The only ones out of focus really are the one in the very front and the one at the very back. The other ones are pretty darn sharp. And as we move to F22, they're all very clear. Because I'm using a 50 millimeter short lens, it did actually, even at F22, create slight blur on my first pin and my last pin. I did not shoot one at F32, but I'm sure that if I had set my lens, this lens doesn't go to F32, but I have some that do, that if I set it to F32, that those 2 last pins would be even more clear. But in a landscape and further back from a subject matter, you won't even notice that slight blurriness. Because I'm so close to the subject and it's a small subject and a more intimate setting, the depth of field is more prominent, and you can see that slight blur. Okay, well, just one last little thing here. I wanted to explain the difference between a long lens and a short lens, and the difference, the effect that they have on making an image. The top lens here is a long zoom or telephoto lens. It's a 70 to 200, and it goes from f4 to f22. And you notice that the largest aperture is only f4, meaning this lens does not do very well in dim light without a tripod or high ISO. The longer the lens, the longer the light takes to reach the sensor. So that's referred to as a slow lens. An f4 on a long lens will have less blurriness in front or behind the subject, depending on how far you are from the subject. So the closer you are and the more zoomed into your subject, the more blurriness or bokeh you'll achieve. The bottom lens here is a short little 50 millimeter lens. It's an f1.8 to f22. This is considered a very fast lens because the aperture on this lens is wide open, allowing for more light to come in. The light doesn't have far to travel to reach the sensor, so that makes it a very fast lens. A lens like this f1.8 can take pictures in very dim light without compromising your ISO or shutter speed, and often can be handheld. Whereas the longer lens with the slower shutter or the slower aperture would require a tripod. I wouldn't hand hold the long lens below 1/40th of a second. In fact, I usually use this lens with a tripod all the time because it's heavy, because it's long, and because when you zoom in, it will have more sensitivity to movement. So it's always a really good idea to use a tripod on a longer, heavier lens. Okay, well, that about does it for the aperture. I hope that I was able to teach you a little something today. I really enjoyed this lesson, and I look forward to making more for you in the future. So check back with me, and I hope to see you again. Thanks so much.